A little girl knocked at midnight. "Mama needs help." The widowed mountain man lit every lantern. Thomas had always loved the mountains. After his wife, Clara, passed away from a long illness, he had retreated even deeper into the heart of the mountains. Life had changed so drastically after her death. The house, once filled with laughter and the warmth of family, felt cold and empty. The only company he had now was his young daughter, Sarah. They lived in a small, humble cabin, tucked away from the rest of the world. There were no neighbors for miles, just endless forests, winding trails and steep cliffs that defined the isolated beauty of their home. The days were quiet and peaceful, though sometimes the silence pressed down on Thomas like a heavy weight. He had never expected to raise his daughter alone. He was a strong man, but this kind of strength was different. He had to be both father and mother to Sarah, and though he loved her with all his heart, he felt a growing loneliness inside. Every morning he would wake up early, light the fire and begin the tasks of chopping wood, preparing food, and making sure their home was warm enough to survive the cold nights. He would work until the sun began to set, his body tired but his mind sharp. Sarah had her own way of coping with the quiet. She was an imaginative child, and she would often disappear into the woods for hours, exploring the natural world around them. It wasn't that she wanted to run away, no, she loved her father dearly. But the woods felt like a second home to her, a place where the echoes of her mother's voice still seemed to linger, where the birds' songs reminded her of Clara's soft laughter. She would talk to the trees, the flowers, and even the rocks, as if they could offer her comfort. Thomas, though concerned, didn't stop her. He knew that for Sarah, the mountains were a place of refuge, a place where memories of her mother were alive. At night, after supper, the two of them would sit by the fire. Sarah would listen to her father's stories about their family, about the old days when they would visit the village for festivals, or when Clara would play the piano while Thomas strummed his guitar. Those stories had always made Sarah smile, but lately she seemed distant. There were nights when she would stare at the empty chair where her mother used to sit, her small face clouded with sadness. Other times, she would whisper softly to herself, as though speaking to someone no one else could see. One evening, as winter began to settle in, Thomas noticed that Sarah had become quieter. She no longer spent as much time in the woods, and when she did, she would return home with an odd look in her eyes, as though she had seen something that troubled her. She didn't tell him what was wrong, but Thomas could tell. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with a peaceful heart. It was the silence of someone holding a secret. He tried to ask her about it, but she would only shake her head and say, "It's nothing, Papa." The first snowfall of the season came early, coating the ground in a soft, white blanket. The mountains looked even more beautiful covered in snow, their jagged peaks softened by the frosty touch of winter. But the snow brought with it a sense of isolation, making the world outside feel distant and unreachable. Sarah didn't like the snow as much as Thomas did. It made her feel trapped in the cabin, as though she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. But she didn't tell him that. Instead, she stayed close to him, her eyes darting around as though expecting something to happen. Thomas, too, felt a growing sense of unease. It was hard to explain. Nothing had changed in their daily routines, and yet something felt different. He began to wonder if the loneliness was getting to Sarah, if the memories of her mother were starting to take their toll on her young heart. He would often find her staring out the window, watching the snow fall in the quiet of the night. She seemed to be waiting for something, though he didn't know what. One particularly cold evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Sarah came to him with a strange request. "Papa, can we light all the lanterns tonight?" she asked, her voice trembling a little. Thomas, surprised by the question, nodded and started pulling out the small lanterns that they used for light in their cabin. He hadn't expected Sarah to ask for something so specific, but he didn't question it. He knew how much she liked the soft glow of the lanterns. There was something about the flickering light that comforted her, reminded her of the warmth of her mother's presence. As he lit each lantern, Sarah would watch, her wide eyes following the flame as if it held some kind of magic. She was quiet that night, even more than usual. Thomas noticed that the shadows in the cabin seemed darker, as though they were moving in ways that shouldn't be possible. The firelight made everything look surreal. Sarah sat close to him, clutching her mother's old shawl around her shoulders. Thomas didn't realize it at the time, but he was starting to feel that same strange unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that was beyond their control. After the last lantern was lit, Sarah went to bed early. She curled up in her small bed, the glow of the lanterns casting soft, dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas, still restless, stayed up a little longer, staring into the fire. He tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that Sarah's unease wasn't just about her mother. There was something else, something deeper. It was then, as the night grew colder and the wind howled outside, that Thomas heard it, the soft sound of a knock at the door. It was faint at first, almost as if he had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock. The sound echoed through the quiet cabin. Thomas's heart raced as he stood up and walked toward the door. He had expected no visitors in the middle of a winter storm, especially not at this late hour. As he reached for the handle, he glanced at Sarah, still sleeping soundly in her bed. Little did he know that the knock would change everything. Something was about to come to them in the night, something that neither of them were ready for. The knock at the door came again, louder this time, and Thomas froze. For a moment he simply stood there, staring at the door. The wind outside howled and the snow beat against the windows, but everything inside was eerily silent. The fire crackled, its warmth filling the room, yet Thomas couldn't shake the cold feeling that had settled over him. It was a feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced over at Sarah, still fast asleep in her bed. She had no idea what was happening, and he wanted to keep it that way. After all, what could a visitor possibly want at this hour? Who would be out in the snowstorm, knocking on his door in the dead of night? The mountains were vast and wild, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. There was no reason anyone should be here. The knock came again. Knock, knock. It was urgent now, filled with desperation. Thomas couldn't ignore it any longer. His heart was racing, and as he walked toward the door, the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in on him. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness and swirling snow. "Hello," Thomas called out, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. His breath fogged up the cold air as he stepped out onto the porch. The night was bitterly cold, and the wind cut through him like a knife. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the snow, no signs of life. The only thing that met his eyes was the thick layer of snow covering the ground and the endless stretch of trees in the distance. He squinted into the night, trying to make sense of the situation. Had he imagined the knock? Was it just the wind playing tricks on him? But no, he knew what he had heard. It had been real. Someone had been out there knocking on his door. But who and why? Thomas stepped back inside and closed the door behind him, his mind racing. He glanced over at Sarah's room. She was still asleep, her small form curled up under the covers. The lanterns were still glowing softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Everything seemed so normal, and yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain, looking out into the night once more. The snowstorm had intensified, and the world outside seemed to have disappeared into a wall of white. There was no sign of anyone out there. No footprints, no movement, nothing. He let out a sigh, trying to calm the unease that had settled in his chest. As he turned away from the window, a strange feeling washed over him, as though he was being watched. It was subtle, but it made his skin crawl. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the isolation getting to him, but the feeling lingered. Then, just as he was about to return to the fire, he heard a soft sound, a faint rustling coming from the direction of the door. It was almost imperceptible, but Thomas's instincts told him that something wasn't right. He hesitated for a moment, then walked cautiously toward the door again. He placed his hand on the doorknob, and for a brief moment he wondered if he was overreacting. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe his mind was simply too tired. But as soon as he opened the door, the air outside hit him with a rush of cold, and his heart skipped a beat. Standing in front of him, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a small figure, a little girl. She was barely taller than Sarah, with a pale face framed by messy hair, her clothes tattered and torn from the storm. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she shivered violently as she stood there, frozen in place. Thomas could see her breath coming out in short, rapid bursts, the cold making her visible in the darkness. The girl's appearance startled him, and he instinctively stepped back, his hand tightening around the door handle. He wasn't sure what to do. The sight of her in the middle of the night in such a violent snowstorm was unsettling. Where had she come from? Why was she out here alone? "Please," the girl whispered, her voice trembling with cold and fear. "Mama needs help." Thomas blinked, his mind struggling to process the situation. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Mama needs help. The girl's eyes were wide, pleading, and her voice barely audible over the howling wind. He could see the desperation in her expression, and it made his heart ache. The snow was coming down harder now, the wind blowing even colder. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice softer now but still full of confusion. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. The girl didn't respond right away. She just stood there shivering, her small hands pressed to her chest as though she were trying to keep warm. "Please," the girl repeated, her voice growing fainter. Mama's sick. She needs help. Please, you have to help her." "She's alone." Thomas's heart sank. He knew the mountains and he knew the dangers they held. He couldn't imagine a child being out here alone in such a terrible storm. The thought of someone in need, someone helpless, stirred something deep within him. The father in him wanted to protect her, to make sure she was safe. He stepped forward, his instincts taking over. "Come inside," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You're freezing. Come inside and we'll figure this out." The little girl didn't hesitate. She stumbled forward, her eyes still wide with fear, and Thomas quickly wrapped his arms around her, pulling her inside out of the cold. As soon as she crossed the threshold, she collapsed into his arms, shivering uncontrollably. He gently guided her to the fire, sitting her down on a chair near the hearth. The warmth of the flames immediately started to thaw her, but she still trembled from the cold. Thomas hurried to grab a blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders as best as he could. The girl's small body was shaking so violently that he could barely keep her still. "Where is your mother?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside her. "Where did you come from? How did you get here?" The girl's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, perhaps fear, perhaps hope, in her gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply nodded toward the door, as if something out there was calling her. "Please," she whispered again, "you have to come. Mama needs you." Thomas's mind raced. Something about this situation didn't make sense, but he couldn't ignore the look in her eyes. The desperation was clear. There was no time to waste. If someone was in trouble, he had to help. He stood up, taking a deep breath. "I'll get my lanterns. We'll go help your mother." And why had she appeared so suddenly in the middle of the night, bringing him such an urgent request? Every instinct in him told him to be cautious, but her eyes, filled with fear and desperation, made him feel as though he had no choice but to act. He grabbed his lanterns from their usual place by the door. He had always kept a few ready, just in case he needed them when the night grew too dark, but now they felt more important than ever. The lanterns would guide them through the storm, through the thick blanket of snow that had already begun to fall heavily outside. The girl watched him quietly from her seat near the fire, her wide eyes following his every movement. She hadn't said much since she entered the cabin. She had only whispered a few words, and then she simply sat there, her small hands still shaking from the cold. Her clothes were worn, and her face was pale, as though she hadn't seen the warmth of a home in a long time. Thomas couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to his door. Why was she out there alone in the storm? Was her mother really in need of help, as she had said? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. This child needed help, and if her mother was truly in danger, he couldn't ignore it. "All right," he said, breaking the silence as he turned back toward the girl. "We'll go. We'll help your mother." The girl's face seemed to brighten at his words, her lips curling into a faint smile. It was the first sign of hope he had seen in her since she arrived, and it made him feel slightly better about the decision he was making. But still, there was a gnawing feeling in his gut, a sense that something wasn't quite right. He grabbed his coat, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside into the biting cold. The wind hit him like a wall, but he didn't hesitate. The snow had piled up quickly, covering the path that led out of the cabin, but he knew the way well. He had walked these paths countless times, even in the worst of storms. His mind was set on getting to the girl's mother, no matter what. The little girl followed him outside, wrapping her arms tightly around herself against the cold. Thomas could see her shiver in the dim light of the lanterns, but she didn't complain. She simply kept walking, her small steps quick and purposeful. She had a determined look on her face, as though she knew exactly where she was going, despite the storm raging around them. As they made their way down the snow-covered trail, the wind howled in their ears and the snow fell in thick, swirling sheets. Thomas had to squint to see anything in front of him. The snowstorm had reduced visibility to almost nothing. The only thing that kept him going was the faint glow of the lanterns in his hands, cutting through the darkness like tiny beacons of light in the swirling white landscape. The girl walked ahead of him, her pace quick, as though she knew exactly where she was leading him. Thomas kept his eyes on her, trying to keep up. His thoughts raced. Who was she? Why had she come to him for help? Was there really someone in danger, or was this some strange trick? His instincts told him to be cautious, but the urgency in the girl's voice, the way she had pleaded for help, kept him moving forward. They walked for what felt like hours, the cold biting into Thomas's skin, the snow growing deeper with every step. The wind howled louder, and the snowflakes seemed to sting his face like tiny needles. He had to stop a few times to catch his breath, his legs growing tired from the long walk through the deep snow. But the girl didn't stop. She kept walking, her small figure barely visible in the distance, her pace unbroken. It was as though she was determined to reach her destination, no matter the cost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, dilapidated cabin. It was barely visible in the snowstorm, just a shadow against the white expanse. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to enter. The girl stopped in front of the cabin and turned to Thomas, her face serious now. "This is it," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Mama's inside." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward. The cabin was old, much older than his own, and it seemed to have been abandoned for years. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow. There was no sign of life, no smoke coming from the chimney, no warmth emanating from inside. It felt wrong, unnatural. He glanced at the girl, who was standing a few feet away, her eyes wide and hopeful but still full of fear. He felt a pang of sympathy for her, but also a growing sense of unease. If her mother was inside, why hadn't she come out to meet them? Why hadn't she called for help? The silence around the cabin was deafening. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't let his fear get the best of him. He had to help this child, and he had to find out what had happened to her mother. He stepped forward, pushing open the door with a creak. The air inside was cold, musty, and still. There was no sign of life. The fire had long since died out, and the room was cast in shadows, the only light coming from the lanterns in his hands. "Hello," Thomas called out, his voice echoing in the empty room. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. The girl stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "Mama," she called softly. "Mama, it's me." Still no answer. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, making Thomas's skin crawl. He stepped inside, his boots creaking on the wooden floor as he moved cautiously toward the back of the cabin. The walls were covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. It felt like the house had been abandoned for much longer than it should have been. And then, from the corner of the room, a faint sound broke the silence. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but Thomas caught it nonetheless. A faint rustle, a barely audible whimper. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. There in the far corner of the room, hidden behind a pile of old blankets and furniture, was a figure. A woman, pale and weak, her body curled up on the floor. Her breathing was shallow and she appeared to be unconscious. "Clara," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. His heart sank as he recognized her. It was his late wife lying there lifeless. But how was this possible? Before he could take another step, the lanterns flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then the little girl vanished. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the figure in the corner of the room. His heart pounded, his thoughts racing. The woman lying there, was it really Clara, his late wife, the woman he had lost to illness all those years ago? He couldn't make sense of it. How could she be here in this cabin, alive and unconscious, when he had buried her with his own hands? His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to blur. The lanterns flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the walls. He took a tentative step forward, his legs unsteady, as though his body couldn't fully comprehend the scene unfolding before him. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. His heart ached with confusion. He had spent so many lonely nights in the mountains, mourning her death. Yet here she was, or someone who looked like her, lying unconscious in a small, dark cabin. But how was that possible? The woman on the floor didn't respond. Her pale face was barely visible in the dim light, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her clothes were torn and dirty, as though she had been lost in the wilderness for some time. Thomas felt a wave of urgency wash over him. He had to get her help. There was no time to waste, but as he reached forward to touch her, a voice behind him stopped him in his tracks. "She's not who you think she is." Thomas spun around, the lantern swaying in his hands. The little girl stood there, her wide eyes fixed on him. Her face was pale, but her expression had changed. There was no longer any fear or desperation in her eyes. Instead, there was something dark, something unsettling, as though she knew more than she was letting on. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his voice rough, his mind struggling to keep up with the whirlwind of confusion. "Who is she then?" The little girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, her tiny feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. She was close enough now that Thomas could see the cold, almost lifeless expression on her face. For a moment, she looked almost unnatural. But that thought vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a deep sense of dread that crept into Thomas's chest. "She's not your wife," the little girl said softly, her voice almost too calm for what was happening. "She never was." Thomas's blood ran cold. He stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. How could this be? The woman lying there, wasn't she Clara? It had to be. Who else could it be? And yet the girl's words echoed in his mind, ringing louder with each passing second. "No," Thomas said, shaking his head, his voice trembling. This is impossible. Clara's gone. She's dead." The girl's expression softened, but there was no sympathy in it, only a strange, knowing sadness, as though she was watching a man struggle with a truth he wasn't yet ready to understand. "You don't get it, do you?" she said. "She's not really here." She never was. The room felt colder. The air itself seemed to freeze around him. Thomas felt a chill seep into his bones, a coldness that wasn't from the storm outside. He turned back toward the figure on the floor, his mind fighting against what the little girl was saying. His hands shook as he reached out toward the woman lying in front of him. His fingers brushed against her skin, cold, so cold. But there was something wrong. Her skin felt like ice, her body stiff and lifeless. Panic began to creep into his chest, clawing at his throat. He had to make sense of this. He had to figure out what was happening. This couldn't be real. Clara was gone. She had been gone for years. He had mourned her, he had buried her, and now here she was, or someone who looked like her. How could he believe anything the girl was saying? "Who are you?" Thomas asked again, his voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The little girl took another step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not doing anything," she replied, "but I can show you the truth. If you're ready to see it." Thomas's heart raced. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in on him. The shadows from the lanterns danced across the room like living things, twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't. The air felt heavy, thick with something that made it hard to breathe. "What truth?" Thomas whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The girl tilted her head, her gaze still fixed on him. "Your wife isn't really dead, not in the way you think. She's here in the mountains, trapped in a way you can't understand." Thomas stared at her, his mind spinning. What was she saying? How could this be possible? He had buried Clara. He had watched her slip away, held her hand as she took her last breath. He had mourned her deeply. But now, standing in front of him, was this little girl, telling him that his wife wasn't dead, that she was trapped here in the mountains, somewhere between life and death. "I don't understand," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "What do you mean? How is she trapped?" Why haven't I seen her all this time?" The little girl's expression darkened. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice soft, almost comforting. "But you can't save her, not like this." Thomas stepped back, shaking his head. His mind was a jumble of emotions, confusion, fear, anger. "What do you mean I can't save her? What do you want from me?" The girl's lips curled into a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "I don't want anything from you except for you to know the truth. The truth about her, about why she's here, and why you'll never have her back." A wave of dizziness washed over Thomas, and he stumbled, bracing himself against the wall to keep from falling. His mind was struggling to catch up with what was happening, but every word the girl spoke seemed to chip away at his understanding of the world. Nothing made sense anymore. Clara was dead. She had been dead for years. And yet, here she was, or was she? And this little girl, who was she? What did she want from him? Suddenly, the lanterns flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Thomas could see his breath fogging in the air. His heart pounded in his chest. He could feel it now, a presence, something darker, something ancient and powerful. "Listen," the girl said, her voice suddenly urgent. "You have to leave now, before it's too late." Thomas didn't understand, but he felt the weight of her words. Something was wrong, very wrong. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, almost alive. He turned toward the door, but before he could take a step, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The room spun, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The lanterns were flickering wildly now, casting flashes of light and shadow that made everything look distorted, unreal. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the room went dark. The wind howled outside, louder than. For a long moment, Thomas stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The girl was gone. The room, which had once been filled with flickering light, was now nothing more than an endless sea of shadows. His breath came in quick, panicked bursts, fogging up in front of him in the freezing air. Everything around him felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on him, pressing against him like they were alive. The air was thick, almost like it was heavy with something he couldn't explain. The floor beneath his feet seemed to shift, the wooden planks creaking and groaning as though the house itself was reacting to whatever had just unfolded. Thomas felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach, but he couldn't move. His body refused to obey his commands. The lanterns had gone out completely. In the pitch black, he couldn't see a thing, but he could hear. The wind outside howled louder, as if it were calling to him, urging him to step outside. The storm had worsened, and the snow was now coming down in thick, blinding sheets, but that wasn't what terrified him. What scared him was the silence that had fallen over the cabin, the unnatural stillness that had taken over the room. Then, in the silence, he heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't coming from the girl, she was gone, and it wasn't coming from the woman on the floor, but it was there, just at the edge of his hearing. A voice, but not just any voice. It was Clara's. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment he forgot how to breathe. Clara's voice. The woman he had buried, the woman he had mourned for so long. She was calling to him. But why and how? Was he losing his mind, or was this something much darker than he could understand? "Clara," he called out, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. His feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor with every step he took. He didn't know if he was walking toward her or into some kind of nightmare, but he couldn't stop himself. The whisper had been so real, so close, and now he had to find out the truth. "Clara," he called again, this time more urgently, his voice echoing in the silent cabin. But there was no response. The room seemed to swallow up his words, leaving nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Thomas hesitated, standing in the darkness, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had to find out what was going on, but he didn't know where to begin. Was it truly Clara he had heard? Or was it some trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the exhaustion of the storm and the strangeness of the situation? He glanced at the woman lying on the floor, the figure who had appeared so much like Clara. The body still looked like her, pale, lifeless, and unmoving. It had to be her. But why did it feel so wrong? Why was the air in the room so thick, so charged with something dark and ancient? Something wasn't adding up. He knelt beside the woman, his heart heavy with a mixture of confusion and grief. He reached out again, his fingers trembling as they brushed against her skin. It was cold like ice. Not the coldness of death, but something else, something unnatural. His mind raced, trying to piece together the events of the night. The little girl's words echoed in his mind. "She's not who you think she is." He had been so sure, so certain that the woman on the floor was Clara. But now, as he touched her skin, he wondered if he had been wrong. Was this truly his wife? Or was it something else, something that had taken her place? A darkness, a trick, a shadow. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible now. He felt an overwhelming urge to get away from the body, but something held him there, something he couldn't explain. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped even further. Thomas could see his breath now, swirling in front of him like smoke. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of the room, moving as if they had a life of their own. A low, guttural sound filled the air, something like a growl, but not quite. It was deep, coming from somewhere beneath the floor, like the cabin itself was alive. He could feel it now, the presence pressing in on him. It wasn't just the storm outside. It wasn't just the wind or the snow. It was something inside the cabin, something ancient. Something malevolent. His heart raced in his chest as he backed away from the woman on the floor. He reached for the lanterns, but they were useless. The darkness seemed to be swallowing everything. The whispering started again, clearer this time, louder. "Help me," the voice said, but this time it was Clara's. It was the little girl's voice. But it wasn't the same child who had come to him for help earlier. This voice was colder, darker, filled with something that made Thomas's skin crawl. "Help me," the voice repeated. "You're too late." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He turned, looking wildly around the room. The walls were closing in on him, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter. He stumbled backward, his feet tangled in the floorboards. He could hear the wind outside, but it was different now. It wasn't just the storm anymore. It was the sound of something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for this moment. The shadows in the room stretched further, moving toward him, swirling like smoke. He could feel them closing in on him, suffocating him. He reached out, desperate to find the door, but it felt as though the room had shifted, had changed, and now he couldn't find his way out. He was trapped. He heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was no one there. Only darkness. His chest tightened, his breath coming in quick gasps. The shadows reached out toward him, tendrils of darkness curling around his legs, pulling him toward the floor. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, to fight, but his body felt frozen, like he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't escape. And then, in the very corner of the room, something moved. A figure darker than the shadows themselves emerged from the blackness. It was tall, towering over him, its face hidden in the darkness. It stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly, 2 points of light in the endless dark. The figure spoke, its voice deep and hollow. "You should have left when you had the chance," it said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Now you belong to the mountain." Thomas's heart pounded as he tried to move, tried to escape, but the shadows held him tight. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into its grip. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure stopped. The room went silent, the wind outside fading into nothing. Thomas, trembling with fear, opened his eyes, and the world around him seemed to shift. The shadows had vanished. The wind was gone, and standing in front of him as though nothing had happened was the little girl. Her expression was no longer cold or sinister. Instead, there was an odd calmness in her eyes. "You should have listened," she said quietly. "It's too late now."